Question number 13. 18th-century economist Adam Smith is famed for his metaphor of the invisible hand, which he putatively used to illustrate a robust model of how individuals produce aggregate benefits by pursuing their own economic interests. Note putatively, as Gavin Kennedy has shown, Smith deploys this metaphor only once in his economic writings to make a narrow point about the then dominant economic theory of mercantilism, and it was largely ignored until some 20th-century economists, eager to secure an intellectual pedigree for their views, elevated it to a fully-fledged paradigm. Which choice best states the main idea of the text? A. Although Smith is famed for his metaphor of the invisible hand, the metaphor was largely ignored until economists in the 20th century came to realize that the metaphor was a robust model that anticipated their own views. B. Some 20th century economists gave Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand a significance it does not have in Smith's work, but it is nevertheless a useful model of how individuals produce aggregate benefits by pursuing their own economic interests. C. Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand has been interpreted as a model of how individuals acting in their own interests produce aggregate benefits, but it was intended as a subtle critique of the economic theory of mercantilism. D. The reputation of Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand is not due to the importance of the metaphor in Smith's work, but rather to the promotion of the metaphor by some later economists for their own ends.
So in number 13, we are talking about 18th century economist Adam Smith, and he is famed for his metaphor of the invisible hand, which he putatively used to illustrate a robust model of how individuals produce aggregate benefits by pursuing their own economic interests. Note, putatively, as Gavin Kennedy has shown, Smith deploys this metaphor only once. So he used only once in his economic writings. That too, to make a narrow point about the then dominant economic theory of mercantilism. This was ignored, but recently some 20th century economists eager to secure. So what is their intention? They are eager to secure an intellectual pedigree for their views and elevated it to a fully fledged paradigm. So they elevated that invisible hand to a higher degree for their views, and they elevated it to a fully fledged paradigm. So we need the choice which best states the main idea of the text. So which should we choose? So if you said D, well done. Choice D is the best answer because it most accurately states the main idea of the text. The text explains that economist Adam Smith's famous metaphor of the invisible hand was putatively. So what does putatively mean? Putatively means widely assumed but not proven. Intended to illustrate a robust model. So what is a robust model? Robust model is consistently accurate generalization of how individuals pursuing their own economic interests can create broader benefits for the population. The text then emphasizes the lack of affirmative evidence for this idea by calling out the term putatively and explaining that according to Gavin Kennedy, Smith used the metaphor only once in his works, in reference to specific circumstances related to the now outdated economic view known as mercantilism, and that metaphor didn't garner much attention until economists in the 20th century held it up as a paradigm. So what does paradigm mean? So paradigm means a theoretical framework in the field. And the metaphor didn't garner much attention until economists in the 20th century held it up as a paradigm, a theoretical framework in the field, and thereby implied that Smith shared some of their views on economics. By emphasizing putatively, the text implies that there is no independent reason to believe that Smith would agree to the metaphor's use outside of the specific context for which he wrote it, and that therefore the 20th century economists who used it so to support their own views without regard for the metaphor's importance to Smith's work. Choice A is incorrect, although the text indicates that Smith's metaphor was largely ignored until some 20th century economists revived it and bolstered its status. The text suggests that later economists used Smith's metaphor to self-servingly boost their own work while ignoring the original context in which Smith wrote it. Moreover, the statement in this choice fails to reflect the text's emphasis on Smith's limited use of the metaphor in his work. Choice B is incorrect, although the text indicates that some 20th century economists altered the significance of Smith's metaphor. The text doesn't suggest that the metaphor is a useful model of how aggregate benefits arise from individual selfish actions, let alone that this usefulness is unaffected by taking the metaphor out of its original context. Choice C is incorrect, although the text indicates that Smith's metaphor was intended as a model of how individuals acting in their own interest produce aggregate benefits, and it was written within the context of the now outdated economic theory of mercantilism. These points are subordinate to the primary idea in the text, which is that Smith's use of the metaphor was tightly constrained, but 20th century economists ignored the original context so that they could use the metaphor to suggest, without support, that Smith would agree with their economic views.